We're joined now, as we are every Wednesday at this time, by Elliot Tepper from Carleton University, political science professor. And you were with us on Friday, Elliot, of course, when history was happening, the inauguration of Donald Trump. And already there's been so much that has happened. There's so much to talk about with regard to the first few days in office. Today we're talking about the wall and about some changes to American immigration policy. And we are seeing, I think, an effort by Donald Trump to get to many of the things on his agenda very quickly.
Yes. Well, good morning, Mark. Yes, we watched history together last Friday, the inaugural address, which was so startling in its tone and in its content and its location, his stump speech right in front of, the establishment, saying the establishment in front of me is the problem, although he didn't mention that his own cabinet behind him is, the establishment. But so we had an isolationist and protectionist announcement and full of midnight in America rather than morning in America rhetoric.
Yeah.
Since then, he certainly has been busy, just as we all expected. His team has basically what we're seeing now is a continuation of the anti-Obama. He is making it clear, the Republican Party with him is making it clear the Obama era is over, and every single step he's going to take right now, immediately, is to show he's undoing the Obama legacy. So yesterday, on Monday, he signed a bunch of executive orders, all relating to things like trade, like the TPP, and also earlier on abortion. He reinstated typical Republican policies on banning any agency that counsels women from talking overseas or at home with U.S. money from talking about abortion. Today, he's now back on security, and it's security of the border, and it's security abroad. The announcement on immigration is really astounding in a way, but at the same time, I'm beginning to think we have to have, Mark, a new phrase for a new way of evaluating Trump. Maybe we have to say, well, it's way bad enough, even though it isn't what we thought it might be. So, yes, he promised he was going to ban Muslims. He signed, we saw that dramatic, Donald J. Trump will ban all Muslims. And then he backed off that. So what we see today is the interpretation, the nuancing of that, saying that countries that are Muslim and produce refugees, they're not going to be sources of taking in refugees.
Yeah.
Not that
he would say, of course, in countries where there's a high number of terrorists. Right?
Yes. Because on the assumption that they can't be vetted. Canada, of course, takes in refugees from those same countries after vetting them. I mean, we have a vetting process. We know it's possible. So this isn't just extreme vetting, as he promised. This is we're not going to nudge, wink, wink, ban Muslims. We're just banning people from those countries that happen to be Muslim because of national security.
Yeah.
So this was a nuance, but it's the same policy. Is he then going to follow it up with a Muslim registry inside the U.S.? Probably not. There's a lot of implications of that position that may not go as far as he said on the campaign trail, but it is way bad enough if your concern is that people are being judged being judged unfairly. So this is his compromise position. It's interesting to see a compromise position emerge.
One of the things that I find interesting about it is, and I think for a lot of Canadians, they're curious about how these things work because he's signing executive orders. These are effectively universal declarations by the new president. Right. There are some limits to the things that he can do, but in some cases he can just, with the stroke of a pen, make big changes to American policy.
The Republicans, to give them full credit, really invested very well over many years. They invested very heavily in demonizing the Clintons, both Clintons. That paid off. They invested very well in creating deadlock in Washington so that the country was fed up with the fact that Congress couldn't do anything, and that's by deliberate choice. We know that they said, we're going to make Obama a one-term president. Didn't quite make that, but they wouldn't confirm anybody. They wouldn't let any bills pass. So particularly after they regained control of the House and the Senate. So they've invested so well that Obama expanded the use of executive orders. He said, well, I still got, this is a quote, I still have a pen and I still have a telephone. So he could still act even though Congress was stopping him. Fast forward, and now we have Donald Trump saying, well, if he can sign executive orders, I can. The constitutionality, the limits of those weren't being tested. The Republicans said over and over again, you cannot sign executive orders like that, President Obama, because you're forgetting Congress.
Right.
You're beyond your constitutional writ. He said, oh, yeah, show me. And he continued to sign them. Remember, he's a constitutional law professor. He knows something about the limits and the parameters. That's not the case with Donald Trump. He said, I'm going to get a lot of things done. So he is deliberately following, as I say, an anti-Obama legacy policy, using the executive order authority that Obama expanded because he couldn't get anything done otherwise.
There are so many different angles that we can talk about from those executive orders in the early days. Now, of course, we're hearing today about the wall. It appears as though something will be built on the U.S.-Mexican border.
Right.
I think during the campaign we heard the term fence used a little bit towards the end of the campaign. Wall was used a lot more earlier in the campaign, but Trump has used the term wall in the past few days in a tweet last night. And he continues to say Mexico will pay for the wall today. Apparently, he made reference to them paying for it later.
Or indirectly or somehow.
Yeah.
So, well, on his first day in office on Monday, he signed something about Obamacare, a pledge. We're going to gut Obamacare. Well, it turns out that executive order didn't exactly gut Obamacare. It set some guidelines and some principles, but it didn't have a legislative effect. And same thing on the wall. He has now signed something that said we're going to do something about a wall. And if he gets into what does a wall mean, who's going to pay for it? And, of course, the joke all along was who's going to build it if you don't let Mexicans in and if you kick out illegals. But there's a lot of issues about that wall. It's very, very long, that border. Some of it is on private, a lot of it's on private land. Are you going to use eminent domain in the southwest of America where they carry guns and where land is sacred and privacy rights are sacred? So there's a lot of issues here, but it's a signal. Just as in gutting Obamacare was a signal, the wall is a signal. There is some concern to me about collateral damage on how he's going to pay for it because, yes, Congress is now going to have to upfront that. He's making a lot of very expensive promises. Congress has to raise the money. He's going to cut taxes. So how will he deal with Mexico on this? Well, he's talking about maybe remittances. People of Mexican descent living in America send a lot of money home. Well, they start putting a tax on remittances. Well, if they do that, generally speaking, countries around the world will be paying a very heavy cost because that's a common practice. People want to look after their families in their countries of origin or their grandparents even in second, third, fourth generations. So there could be some interesting side issues coming out of that. But all of this comes back to the realm of symbolism. He is going to be the anti-Obama, and he's fulfilling not just his agenda on the wall, but all these other issues aren't necessarily his agenda. They're the Republican Party agenda that's been long-standing. We've talked about this. This is the era of Republican dominance, Republican Party dominance. They are going to get their way. The whole issue of, what's going to happen to the restraints on Wall Street. Well, we know that the cabinet is now full of people who really come from Wall Street, and the same on the environment and the energy sector. Well, we know that the EPA, if you take a look at all this, he keeps appointing people in charge of major departments who are opposed to those departments. It's starting with the Environmental Protection Agency. He's got Pruitt coming in who's suing them because he doesn't like them. So restraints on Wall Street are likely to go, and we'll see that as part of the symbolic gestures, and the same on the environment.
All right, coming up, we'll talk about how Canada deals with the Trump administration. There was just a 2-day cabinet retreat where they talked about that a lot, from what we're told. And we'll also talk about some developing stories in Europe that are very connected to what we saw in the United States. Elliot Tepper is with us every Wednesday on Ottawa Today from Carleton University. And we'll be right back. And then coming up at 11:30, Henry Burris is going to join us.
Welcome back to Ottawa Today with Mark Sutcliffe on 1310 News and Rogers TV.
Elliot Tepper is with us every Wednesday on Ottawa Today. Coming up at 11:30, we'll be joined by retired Ottawa Redblacks quarterback Henry Burris. We're continuing to follow the breaking news from the Senators today, a change in their top executive position. Tom Anselmi is the new CEO of the team. Cyril Leader is out effective immediately. Elliot Tepper, let's talk about Canada and the United States. I imagine they talked about the Trump administration a lot in the cabinet retreat this week in Calgary.
Yes, Calgary, an interesting choice of a location. We could probably stand back again saying, what's the Trump administration mean, and then bring it home to Canada. We just talked about a lot of things that are just basically anti-Obama. But it's also heading now toward a showdown between the Republican Party and the new president, and it hits right home on the first thing. Basically, we're leaving a world where Canada has felt comfortable, which is a world of multilateralism, where you don't want to be the squirrel facing the elephant all by yourself. So Canada's been a big investor in acting in multilateral ways. And I think we're entering the period now of bilateralism, and Canada's scrambling to adjust. So that's what I think we see in front of us right now. Let's start with the TPP. One of the things that the anti-Obama flurry of executive orders did out of Trump was to finally definitively kill the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Canada is a big supporter of a multilateral trading regime, the TPP. Remember, we also have one on the go with Europe across the Atlantic with CETA, which is, by the way, moving ahead, fitfully, but moving ahead. So what we see now is Canada having to adjust to a world where multilateralism is out and bilateralism is in, and what do we do about it? Well, I think Canada has acted so far very cleverly, because we've talked about this. Almost immediately, people were sent to Trump Tower to talk from this government to key decision makers. That is Jared Kushner and Steve Bannon, the two closest advisors, arguably, to the president. We've had Brian Mulroney, who, remember, NAFTA is the next thing we'll talk about here, the architect of NAFTA, when he, I think, used that as a way to get under the blanket of the last time the U.S. went protectionist, so Canada got that arrangement. But all those are now in question. So what about NAFTA? It looks to me like the era of Donald Trump is the era of every country for itself.
Right.
Multilateralism? Well, we're going to be quick and adjust to that. It looks like Canada just threw Mexico under the bus and saying, well, really, this is a paraphrase from our new foreign minister, most of what we do with the U.S. is bilateral anyway. And so there's a lot of talk and a very effective set of arrangements being put in place to try to deal with this bilateralism. And it has, I think, some limits. Let's talk about the success. At that Calgary retreat, a senior power figure advising the administration came to Calgary from the U.S., a fellow named Schwartzman. He's head of something called BlackRock, a person of real substance in the U.S. financial community. And as it turns out, according to Chrystia Freeland, an old and good friend of hers, came to say, don't worry about it, Canada. We're not aiming at you. We're aiming at Mexico, so you should be okay. In fact, Canada is going to be a model because this is a balanced economic arrangement. What does this do to NAFTA? So all that is good. XL is being approved. Canada is saying, good for Canada. I say that Canada is acting nimbly on this. Whether it's good for Canada in the long run, we'll have to see. But on the XL is going to be approved. Canada has been pushing for that. That's part of the current government, Canadian government's position. That's the Republican Party position. And now it's the Trump administration's position. Now, whether the market forces still make that economical or not is an open question. We'll have to see. That's market forces. Politically speaking, Canada is now dealing with the fallout of a Trump administration. But it has, despite the nimbleness, some possibilities of coming hard up against core realities that we are still out of sync on the environment, on issues we just talked about, immigration and refugees. Canada's complained about refugees from Syria is we can't get enough of them. That is not the American position. So at some point, values and realpolitik will crash and clash into each other, and that's pretty well where we are on that for the moment.
All right, let's talk quickly. We have a couple minutes left on the situation in Europe because obviously the ramifications of Trump's victory are being felt everywhere, and we're seeing trends that are not necessarily directly connected but related to Donald Trump in other countries.
Yes, I think another big trend isn't just multilateralism giving way to bilateralism, but we're seeing the weakening of the bonds of the very things that have held the world together in the terms of the Western world, Canada's role, and in terms of U.S. leadership in both Europe and in Asia. So what we have just seen in a town called Koblenz is actually a formal meeting of the right-wing populist parties. the alt-right parties. This is a Steve Bannon Dream Alliance. This is a group of people who take the same vocabulary but with a heavier dose of nationalism and patriotism and maybe a subtext of anti-Semitism and anti-Islamist rhetoric. So they hope to come to power. We've talked about this. March 15th, one of the people there is leading in the polls in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, they may come to, one of these alt-right parties may come to power, populist right-wing parties. France is coming up, April, first round. Marine Le Pen convened this session there, and then we go on to Britain in the fall of 2017 and Brexit. The first visitor to America's new administration is Theresa May, and she's coming to talk about what? Well, probably bilateral trading agreements, because now Britain has to do that all around the world. But what's interesting about the Koblenz meeting is it's a meeting of parties, political parties, which are still carrying forward this nationalist trend, the progressive trend, anti-elite trend, anti-EU trend, Eurosceptics, and these are supported by Russia. Financially, by false news. You know, did you hear refugees are harassing women? Those are false stories. So there's a multi-pronged approach by Russia, overlapping the interest of the new incoming American administration, which will lead to a weakening of the constraints on Russia in terms of its expansionist policies in Europe. And the TPP, which we just talked about, is, by abandoning that, you're abandoning American leadership of the world trading regime relating to China. And if U.S. doesn't set the rules with the TPP, and Canada was a big supporter of that, now gone, then that just opens up the path to Chinese expansionism. Now, Mark, this is at the same time that America is going to have an increased military spending, increased military presence. So we have a weakening of the restraints, and at the same time an increase of the likelihood of a pushback militarily by America. This is a very dangerous situation.
Always a pleasure to hear your thoughts on what's happening in the world, Elliot, and what it all means. Thank you very much for your time today.
Always more to talk about, Mark.
Yeah, we'll be talking again next week, next Wednesday. Elliot will be back. Elliot Tepper from Carleton University.